Pure Zen. Greetings, everybody. This is Serpentine 451, and welcome to episode 3 of Manga Maniacs, where we'll be discussing Goblin Slayer Year 1 and the main series Goblin Slayer itself. And joining me, as always, is my friend Jeffrey. How you doing tonight, Jeffrey?
I'm doing fantastic. I got my Katawa Shoujo shirt on and I feel ready as Betty Spaghetti. Now, we have two radically different perspectives on this story because you went into it as a Goblin Slayer fan, whereas I read this and then read Goblin Slayer. So I think it'll be interesting if we do the spoiler-free review right here with you coming from the Goblin Slayer fan perspective, and then me coming from it as like a perspective of what's a Goblin Slayer? I'm too old. My hip hurts.
As someone who actually takes care of old people for a living, I kind of find that a bit offensive, but that's perfectly okay. Anyway, Year 1, it's still ongoing, so it still has a lot of time to further develop the side characters and give a little bit more context to the backstory of our protagonist, Goblin Slayer. And if you don't know what Goblin Slayer Year 1 is, it's essentially a prequel story. And sometimes most prequel stories hit some fallbacks because they can't tell. They can tell their own self-contained story, but they have to make sense within their main series narrative.
Now, Tony, you, that was a pretty good one, but I happen to notice that you might be coming across as a little defensive this early into the review. Is that because I didn't like it, or is it because you felt like it needs defending after having just read it?
To be honest, I think you're giving a prequel story a low score without it kind of showing its full potential as of yet. Sure, you can still rate it whatever you want. It's probably not to your taste, which is perfectly acceptable. But I'm just playing more so the devil's advocate, so to speak.
Right. So this is Goblin Slayer. You're assuming that everyone who watches this show knows what it is. Why don't you go ahead and tell us, like, what is Goblin Slayer? You know, what's the premise of it, and why would I want to read it?
Well, if anyone's a big fan of dark fantasy and those who've actually been watching Weeb Warriors will know that Goblin Slayer essentially tells the story of an adventurer whose name is Goblin Slayer because in this world, no one really has names. And he goes on adventures, well, doing what his namesake does, slay goblins. That's essentially it.
Now, these goblins aren't like great goblins from World of Warcraft or like hobgoblins or the goblins from Pan's Labyrinth or anything like that.
No, these goblins are your typical mook enemies, because the other adventurers in the Adventurers Guild see them as nothing but mook enemies. But if you get them in large numbers, they may be unintelligible at times, but they can be very cunning creatures, like our protagonist in the story always tells people. And they're ultimately brutal little creatures.
That is correct. Essentially, this story kind of feels like what would happen if somebody made Doom Guy into a Dungeons and Dragons character.
Essentially.
Now, despite what some people might have told you, I actually do like the original Goblin Slayer manga. I'm going to refer to the original as Goblin Slayer and the side story as Year 1 from now on to avoid any confusion.
Okay, that's perfect.
I thought the Goblin Slayer was all right. It had pretty spectacular art. The writing was pretty good. It was just I'm not a big fan of the darker elements, so I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5, but an objective rating of a 4 out of 5. It just didn't really appeal to my interests.
Well, it's perfectly acceptable because there's, as someone who fairly knows your taste, you're not too much of a fan of the darker stuff.
Yeah, what can I say? I just don't want to read about Green Lantern opening a fridge and finding his dismembered fiance.
Or he's not a big fan of horrible things and would rather read something like One Piece.
Yes. Luckily, we're not. But however, we're not focusing on Year 1 today. We're focusing on Please Don't Bully Me Nagatoro, which
we're still doing Goblin Slayer Year 1 and Goblin Slayer.
Okay. Well, please don't bully me. Goblin Slayer Year 1 is a prequel to that. It focuses more directly on the goblin slaying of Goblin Slayer. It's pretty direct. So the spoiler-free review, if you like dark fantasy, definitely check out Goblin Slayer. Year 1, as I will be explaining shortly, I feel is not worth your time. Even if you're a fan of Goblin Slayer, I wouldn't say it's worth looking into. What do you think, Tony?
Well, I can disagree with you on that. It can give you a greater context to the world itself, albeit it may come off as. What I'm trying to say here is that it's a great companion piece, but telling its own self-contained story, it does not. Essentially, can tell its own self-contained stories in the form of showing off other characters and how they came to be who they are in the main series, which is perfectly acceptable. Because what this series does is, since it doesn't give a lot of these characters, it doesn't give these characters names, just their job titles and what they do.
Kind of like Heart of Darkness in that regard.
Yeah, so exploring a little of who they are as individuals is perfectly acceptable. So at least I would give this, personally, I would give Year 1 at least a 3 out of 5. Solely because it could be a good companion piece. It can tell its own unique stories, and it develops a lot of characters other than our titular character. And whereas Goblin Slayer itself, much like I'll give in the Weeb Warriors side of things, its anime adaptation is brilliant, and its manga, it's actually a little bit more brutal than the anime would like you to believe at times. But I would still say that it's a good 4.5 out of 5, at least for a read. If you are willing to read it once, that's perfectly acceptable. I think it's great. Well, that's because that's showing a bit of bias in my end, because I tend to like a lot of darker things. But still, objectively, I would say it's a good 4.5 out of 5. If you enjoy like great artwork and some very great moments where characters can be really cool and badass at one point, and when stronger goblins are about, you get to see pure abject terror on the characters' faces.
Yeah, like you bring up a lot of good points and a lot of strong elements that Goblin Slayer has. If you're a fan of darker fantasy, Goblin Slayer is definitely something to check out. But I'd like to take a moment here and break down exactly how Year 1 fails in every single department that Goblin Slayer succeeded in. Because I actually finished Year 1 and was saying to myself, this was awful. This doesn't deserve an anime adaptation. This can't be how bad the original was. And then I read Goblin Slayer, and almost every problem I had with Year 1 was completely fixed or just wasn't present at all. It's actually surprising to me that these are the same author who created both of these. Like, everything. So let's take a moment here and go into what I think is probably the most important aspects for manga, which is the art. That's the base score line. The writing, we usually have plus or minus modifiers on it. But would you agree? Would you say that manga, one of the most important factors is the quality of the art?
I would, depending on who the artist is, I would say that manga, much like Western comics, can really live or die by its art.
Yeah, I agree.
But I essentially believe that, well, one of my favorite artists in Japan who doesn't even draw manga is Sayori, who they do the art for not only Nekopara but Tropical Liqueur and The Ditzy Demons Are in Love with Me. I just really enjoy that art because it makes a lot of the characters pop in a way.
As just a real quick note, Tony, you know I have nothing but respect for you, but as I Google Nekopara, that respect, it's diminishing. It's fading away. Catgirl maids.
I am okay with Catgirl maids.
I could be your Catgirl maid, senpai.
No, go die.
Okay, so the art of Goblin Slayer is great. It's a 4 out of 5. You know, that's a very solid score for art. It's pretty technically impressive. The line art is strong and bold, and it's frequently depicting like fantastical monsters and grotesque imagery, and it does this fantastically with many shots of Goblin Slayer's one glowing eye, usually against a very dark background, heavily detailed armor and very detailed goblins. However, Year One completely drops the ball here. It fumbles spectacularly. Almost every single shot of Goblin Slayer that was meant to be taken seriously is either a really boring and not at all super stylized shot of his glowing eye, or it's the same flipping shot of his head from this angle, looking from slightly above with the rungs on his armor slightly scratched at to imply darkness. It is incredibly boring compared to Goblin Slayer Year One. But more than that, it's incredibly visually confusing at times because you see in manga you have foreground characters and then the background. These are almost always immediately distinctible, and this is true in Year One. You can easily tell the characters from their backgrounds. However, when another character is right up against another, or is right in front of or behind another character, it becomes incredibly visually muddy. Add on to this the fact that Goblin Slayer Year One will frequently have battles defined more by Goblin Slayer's ability and nimbleness and quick thinking, and you end up with lots of combat situations where Goblin Slayer is right up in someone's face, and you have dozens of panels of him almost sort of grappling with a single goblin. This is incredibly confusing. I would have to reread a page multiple times just to figure out what is going on. And even then, even more confusing elements of it would be when they use solid black sound effect notes, which are pretty common in manga, and then also have solid black blood. There would be points where you can't distinguish the character's outline from the blood they're leaking from the sound effects that are appearing on the screen. Overall, I would say the art direction in Goblin Slayer Year One is a very weak 2.5 out of 5, especially compared to how fantastic Goblin Slayer was. This is a competent artist. It just doesn't make any sense to me how Goblin Slayer can look so much better than Year One. What do you think? Did you have any notes on this? Like, did you notice the repeated use of the single shot of Goblin Slayer's face, the very boring aspects of whenever Goblin Slayer, or the muddy aspect, you know?
Although, now that I think about it, yeah, it does do that, but in my honest opinion, it doesn't really hinder it.
I would disagree there because Goblin Slayer fighting goblins is half of the entire story. Um, Not understanding what's going on when he's fighting the hobgoblin or when he's stabbing the shaman really detracts from the visceral pulp feeling that a lot of Goblin Slayer had and almost banked on. You know, a shot of Goblin Slayer fighting the Beholder or shots of him intimidating goblins were really cool in the original, and they're just not present here at all. Now, the exception to this would be when they're fighting the Rockworm, but when a bunch of adventurers are fighting the Rockworm, but I have my own problems there. So, on to writing here. The writing in Goblin Slayer was, I would say it was practical. You know, Goblin Slayer had very straightforward writing. It had a bunch of characters that were neat. Goblin Slayer bounced off of a lot of this cast very well. How do you feel about the writing in Goblin Slayer?
Like, in the main series, I think it's very serviceable. And the latest chapter of Goblin Slayer is actually a majority of it's a nice interaction between him and the farm girl, and how she is ultimately jealous of the attendant going on a date with someone that she has pined for many years.
Yeah, I but so Goblin Slayer Year One, however, it does not have this pro. The pacing and the character writing are two different factors here. But Goblin Slayer Year One fumbles both of them really hard. The character writing, no interesting character interacts with Goblin Slayer. You don't have any of the really interesting characters from the original. You don't have the priestess, you don't have the lizard man, you don't have the elf, you don't have the dwarf. All you have is the lancer, the witch, and some rando other adventurer along with the clerk lady. So none of those characters are very interesting. But even worse is they aren't even relevant in the original story. This is they don't get any chance to expand on their personality at all. They're just like, hey, we're kid versions of the Goblin Slayer, kid versions of the Goblin Slayer characters, We're just gonna stand around here and pretty obviously have the exact same reaction to Goblin Slayer we do in the original story.
Actually, we do get introduced to at least one character that we are used to in year one.
Oh, the farm girl that is basically like a sister to Goblin Slayer. That was really well done, honestly. When I think back on her backstory, it's so interchangeable between year one and Goblin Slayer that I completely forget which parts are year one. The interactions with him and the farm girl were well handled. I will admit that it felt very natural to start with year one and then move to Goblin Slayer and have this character be appearing in both. But the main thing that gets me about this writing, and the reason it docks a full point away from Goblin Slayer's final score, is that right here. Let me phrase it this way, Tony.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you were writing this manga. Let's say that you wanted to focus on Goblin Slayer fighting some goblins. How would you make that interesting? How would you spice it up a little?
Hmm.
I'm gonna go
How would
ahead.
I spice up the dialogue when he's fighting goblins?
Yeah, you could do that. You could like focus on his struggle or his evolution and all that, and it does do that at times. Now I noticed that your answer was not cut away to a completely different group of adventurers fighting things that are not goblins. So why would they do that? Why would they spend half of the entire series focusing on some random adventurer and then just cutting away to have him fight against a rock monster? When we cut away from some really dramatic points of Goblin Slayer fighting goblins to cut to a bunch of adventurers fighting against a rockworm. Why? Why did they need it? Completely kills the pacing. It's so bad. Why would you do that? You pick up Goblin Slayer to read about a guy named Goblin Slayer slaying goblins. I did not pick up a bunch of rando adventurers fight a rockworm that eats people. Yeah, that isn't in the title of Goblin Slayer. It's not the title of year one either, honestly. It's really disappointing because whenever I would get into the goblin slaying, which would occasionally I would get taken out of it by either really muddy panels that were really confusing to follow, or I would be taken out of it directly by deciding that the author just wanted to cut over to these random adventurers fighting rockworms and gels, or something else. It just kills the flow of the entire manga, and that's why it docks a point for me, because it gets even worse on rereads. Because I just wish that they had just segregated them into different parts, or hey, just don't cut to this random adventurer. I don't even think he appears in Goblin Slayer, the sword guy who has his party members die.
Yeah, he
He's like
actually
the
does
second main
pop in.
character. Yeah,
And he's a member of one of the guild. He's a member of one of the guilds that actually helped him out in this rock form endeavor.
I yeah, it just shows how much he stuck with me. It's just I feel like there are interesting things to focus on in the Goblin Slayer universe. It's a Dungeons and Dragons themed universe. There's tons of stuff to do. There's tons of monsters, tons of lore. But I want to experience that with Goblin Slayer. I want to have him go on adventures wherein the characters are enjoying themselves and having a good time because I'm having a good time. And then I'll feel bad when the situation gets in danger. I didn't care about the random adventurer guy against the rockworm. If he had died, I would just been all like, oh, cool. Are they going to cut to Goblin Slayer killing goblins yet? And then when he succeeded and finally earns the respect of his guild members, I'm like, cool. Could you cut back to Goblin Slayer, please? That would be nice. I wouldn't mind that. This is a prequel that focuses on Goblin Slayer. It's Goblin Slayer Year One, but half of the story is completely unrelated to Goblin Slayer. It's I just don't get it. That's why the writing gets a point docked away from me. The art already had 2.5, and that's why my final score for Goblin Slayer Year One is a very weak 1.5 out of 5. there are stories that handle exactly what Year One is trying to do, and they handle it way better. One of those is Goblin Slayer. Goblin Slayer is way better than Year One. And if you start with Year One, you're just gonna be like, why are we focusing on these random characters? And then Goblin Slayer proper will start, and you'll be like, oh cool, an entire manga about the one character I liked from Goblin Slayer Year One. It's Goblin Slayer. You don't cut away from Doom Guy to focus on the random researchers. I don't know. So you've heard my ramblings on about it. Do you still feel like I'm not giving it that fair shake?
Well, I can understand your complaints when it comes to that. Stuff like that doesn't really bother me because sometimes I like the adventures of the titular character, but when it comes to like exploring the world itself, because if we're mostly exploring the world from the narrative perspective of our protagonist, it's going to be a very small world, so to speak. And using other characters to kind of expand upon a lot of the innate, like the different types of monsters and different locations in this world, is a better way of going about things. Sure, it may hinder the pacing about one part of the story a bit, but I think it's more in the sense that it wants to expand the world rather than just kind of keep the narrow perspective of our protagonists.
I mean, yeah, that's a solid argument, except that Goblin Slayer is constantly stepping out of his comfort zone in the original Goblin Slayer manga. He's going on adventures in completely exotic locales, dealing with elves and learning about the cultures of different races, and he even went to
Well, true. That's because he essentially is. He's more or less being conscripted by the Elven Archer to go on more adventures with her and her party, simply because they see him as a very powerful and high-ranking adventurer.
I get what you're saying.
But
they had story reason for that. Still, that's a more interesting story direction to take than focusing on the rockworm fight.
oh, and think of it like this: in the main series, we also cut away at certain points in the manga to other characters doing amazing things, like the hero, for example, where she and her compatriots take down a collection of evil entities.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure
Yeah,
that happened.
yeah,
I completely believe you.
that actually does happen.
I suppose from my perspective, the reason that I'm not really latching onto these things is that I like Goblin Slayer as a character. His Doom Guy-esque persona and his interaction with other party members. I guess I sort of tune out whenever it's not focusing on him. You'd think
Yeah,
that the
and
one manga that
what's
I don't have that problem in
interesting.
would be called Goblin Slayer, though. They focus on him enough that you wouldn't have to worry about sitting through boring bits. There
And
weren't
you know
boring
what's
bits in Goblin
and
Slayer.
fun fact here, the chapter in year one where after he fights a whole bunch of goblins, he actually runs to a little girl that will later become the hero.
Oh,
So,
yeah, I get you. I get you.
so in a way, he is the influence that made her into the chosen hero. And in that same chapter, we see a younger version of the priestess.
Man, like, any of these other perspectives, honestly, would have been more interesting to focus on than the Rockman fight. Cutting to the hero as she's growing up learning this stuff, like, focusing on where the other characters were during this time gap period, like the elf, the dwarf, and whatnot, focusing on how they meet and hook up. Any of that would have been more interesting than the Rockworm fight.
Since both of these series are still ongoing, we should at least give them more time. So there may be stories where we focus on like the formation of the party between the elf, the dwarf, and the lizard man.
Yeah, there could be, but
And you can also have the potential of one side story talking about the hero and how she becomes the hero.
that is true. This thing about that is, though, that when those come out, if those are more interesting than what we have now, then there's really no excuse for the author to have wasted our time by focusing on the Rockworm fight instead of getting to the content that was actually good. If I had to make a guess as to why he has the Rockworm fight, it's because the Goblin versus Goblin Slayer fights were so messy and hard to follow. The arts during the Rockworm fight is way better. It does not have this problem at all. And I guess that's why he cut away, because people might have gotten frustrated if it was just Goblin Slayer wrestling with goblins.
In which that could be a perfectly good reason. Who knows? Since we have no connection to the author, we wouldn't have any idea what his thought process is. So, although I think you've presented your case well enough, and sure, at some points I agree with you, and at some I disagree with you. But this is why a show like this is a very good thing, because you can have different perspectives on the things that we read. So things don't typically become like the same thing, that we ultimately love the same series, or one of us likes the series and the other kind of detests it a bit.
True.
So
I'm glad that we can get to some common ground, though, even though our scores are different, with mine being 1.5 out of 5 and yours being 3 out of 5. We can both agree that it was worse than the original series.
I mean, it's more, I wouldn't say it's worse compared to the original. I'd say it's serviceable, not worse. It's a good companion piece to want if you want to know a little bit more about the world and the backstory that isn't completely told in the main series.
I see. I don't completely understand then why it's got that 1.5 point dock from the original then. Could you explain?
No, I'm saying from year one, it's 3 out of 5, and in the main series, it's 4.5.
Right, yeah, so there's a 1.5 point discrepancy between them. I figured that your score was more focused on like an analytical review of like how good is this series, whereas mine is like, is it worth reading?
I mean, it does have its problems, but I can detract its problems for the sake of exploring more of the world and a little bit more of the backstories of other characters other than our protagonist, because I like to see more, in a way, fleshed out characters in this world, even though they're nameless.
Oh, so what you're saying is just year one just doesn't have as much that pops that gives Goblin Slayer its higher score.
Yeah, that's right.
I got you. That makes sense. I wish year one had more of those popping moments. I can't really think of any aside from a couple of Rockworm moments where the art is just spectacular, but I'm not invested in it at all, because if that character had died, I would have just not cared. I
And
I,
plus, the farmland raid arc is very spectacular in the main series.
yeah.
And that shows fights of the other adventurers fighting regular goblins, goblin champions. It was beautifully animated.
As an audience, we care about that fight because we've already been shown the stakes, and we know that Goblin Slayer's cute farm waifu girl will be hurt. We're invested in it. But even what happens if the Rockworm is killed?
Nothing really. We just see one character gain retribution for what the Rockworm did to his party.
Yeah. At the same time, though, like, I just think that year one, especially as a non-Goblin Slayer fan, since I read it first, it was just constantly cutting away to these characters I had no idea or interest in at all, because I don't know that they appear later. So what's the point? They're not interesting on their own. I don't know who they are, and I don't have context for it. And it's really a poor showing, honestly, from the Goblin Slayer author. It's like, I know he can do better now that I've read Goblin Slayer. But if I didn't know that Goblin Slayer was good, if you hadn't recommended it, I would have stopped at year one, because I would have just been disappointed, like, oh, this is just shock factor and poor writing.
Which that's perfectly fine for you to feel that way. I mean, some prequel stories don't typically hit the landing, so to speak. Like FE7, for example. It's a good game on its own, but trying to tell its story from the perspective of FE6, there's a little issues there, little discrepancies that people try to sweep under the rug.
Yeah. So, in short, Goblin Slayer, I don't recommend it. However, there are other series that can do what Year One I don't recommend. Goblin Slayer I still recommend. If you're into darker stuff, of course. But other things do, if you're interested in the Dungeons and Dragons-esque setting, Dungeon Meshi is fantastic and nails almost everything that Goblin Slayer was trying to do except for the dark setting. If you're into dark settings, read Berserk. All I'm really saying here is that everything does something. There's something for every element that Goblin Slayer Year One does. Something else is doing it better. The number one there is that Goblin Slayer is doing it way better. And Dungeon Meshi is doing it way better. And then Berserk is doing it way better. Goblin Slayer Year One, there's nothing stand out. If you're desperate for more stuff in the dark fantasy genre, maybe Goblin Slayer can slate that for a little bit. But even though I only took around 45 minutes to finish the series, I still wish that I could get that time back. I don't think it was worth it. Goblin Slayer, however, heck yeah. I'd probably reread that, because there are some bits that I really enjoyed, even though I'm not into the darker setting.
All right. Well, I think we'll end this episode here. We'll have something more lighthearted and fun for next week. But I think with this episode in particular, ladies and gentlemen, we can see more agreements and disagreements in the future as long as we handle this like true intellectuals and gentlemen.
And professionals, because I'm not intellectual at all.
Yeah, let's go with that. As long as we handle this in a professional and intellectual manner, I think we'll get by okay. Because unlike other channels and whatnot, I don't want to get into screaming matches or just basically condemn people for being idiots, like I tend to do on Wheat Warriors most of the time. But oh well.
But I don't think that could happen reasonably here. We've both got a ton of respect for each other. Or at least I have respect for you. I'm pretty...
I respect you, my friend. I also respect my good friend Jordan. And Jay, even though he's a good friend of mine, I hope that we can have him join in for Wheat Warriors at some point in time, even though his busy schedule pretty much keeps him from doing so on the average, you know? But we're going to end this episode here. Tune in next week for our next series that we're going to be reviewing. It's going to be very fun and lighthearted because we're going to go, like I mentioned last week, we're going to go from tragedy to comedy and just interchange that every week.
See you next time, everybody.
Catch you next time, folks.